The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the dusty frontier town, painting the wooden buildings in gold and amber. Birds called lazily from the rooftops, and the faint scent of smoke from cooking fires mingled with the dry, earthy smell of the desert. For a young woman named Clara, just arrived from a far-off settlement, the town felt simultaneously exhilarating and threatening. She clutched her satchel tightly, aware of how out of place she seemed among the rough, sunburned men and wary townsfolk. Every glance from the townspeople felt heavy, almost measuring her worth in this harsh new world. She had been sent to deliver supplies to the general store, an errand that should have been mundane, but her nerves were on edge. Clara had grown up in a sheltered home, her life structured and predictable. Here, every sound, the creak of a wagon wheel, the distant bark of a dog, the low murmur of voices felt amplified. She walked cautiously, her boots stirring up tiny clouds of dust on the street. Then she saw him. A figure leaning casually against the post of the general store caught her attention. He was tall, his frame imposing, yet there was a grace in the way he moved. His skin was bronzed by the sun, his dark eyes steady and observant, as if he could see every detail and every intention in the room. The townspeople gave him a wide berth. Whispers followed him like a shadow. He was known in town as an Apache warrior, a man of formidable skill and unquestionable reputation. Most people feared him. Clara felt her stomach tighten, not with fear exactly, but with a strange, unidentifiable tension. As she stepped forward, trying to act as composed as possible, the man straightened and watched her approach. There was a moment when the world seemed to pause, the caw of a crow, the creak of the wagon wheel. Even the wind itself seemed to hush. Clara felt an unusual awareness of his presence, like a current running through the air, strong and undeniable. Delivering supplies? His voice was low, calm, and carried a resonance that made her pulse quicken. He didn't smile, but there was something in his gaze, a curiosity perhaps, or a cautious assessment that made her cheeks warm. "Yes," she said softly, adjusting the satchel on her shoulder. Her voice sounded louder than intended in the quiet space between them. He nodded once, as if satisfied, then stepped slightly closer, not threatening, but present. "It's rare to see someone like you here," he said. There was no malice in his tone, only an honest observation. Clara blinked, unsure how to respond. She was aware of the contrast between the roughness of the town and the calm authority in his manner. I'm just visiting," she managed to say. "From back east." "East," he repeated, almost like tasting the word. "A different world, I imagine." "Yes," she said, her voice catching a little. "Very different." For a moment neither of them spoke. Clara felt the oddest sensation, a mix of fear, excitement, and something else she couldn't yet name. Everything around her, the harsh sun, the dusty streets, the distant hum of life, seemed to blur, and all she could focus on was him. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her feel both exposed and safe at the same time. Finally he spoke again, his tone quieter now. "You'll need to be careful in this town. Not everyone is as forgiving as they seem." She nodded, understanding the warning but feeling a strange sense of trust toward him. There was something in the way he stood, the way he observed without judgment, that made her believe he would not let harm come to her, not if he could prevent it. And then, without another word, he moved aside, allowing her to enter the store. Clara stepped inside, but a part of her remained aware of him, of the silent acknowledgement between them. In that brief encounter, something had shifted. Her world, once predictable and constrained, now felt like it could expand, stirring with unknown possibilities, danger, and perhaps something deeper than she had ever experienced before. In that moment, Clara realized that everything was about to change. The town, the desert, and the life she had known would no longer be enough to define her. She had crossed paths with a man who would challenge her, captivate her, and ultimately change the course of her life. The next morning, Clara woke to the harsh glare of the sun spilling through the thin curtains of the boarding house. The town was already stirring. The distant clip-clop of horses, shouts from the general store, and the occasional creak of a wagon wheel reminded her that life here moved quickly, and without mercy. She dressed carefully, tightening the laces of her boots, and set out to finish her errands. As she walked through the dusty streets, a sense of unease crept over her. Something in the air felt different, heavier. The usual hum of the town seemed off, muted, as if the wind itself carried a warning. Clara's pulse quickened. She glanced around, catching fleeting glimpses of shadowed alleyways and shuttered windows, and realized she wasn't the only one sensing the tension. And then she saw them, a group of men, strangers to the town, moving with predatory precision, bandits by the look of them, armed and calculating. Their eyes flicked over the storefronts as they advanced, and Clara recognized the danger immediately. Panic flared in her chest, sharp and unrelenting. She knew instinctively that running alone would only make her an easier target. Just as her fear threatened to overwhelm her, she felt a presence beside her. The Apache warrior from yesterday appeared as if from the shadows. His movements fluid, his posture alert. His eyes scanned the bandits, assessing the threat with lethal precision. Clara's stomach tightened, a mixture of relief and awe washing over her. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that carried both command and reassurance. "Don't make sudden movements." She obeyed instinctively, moving beside him, heart pounding. He guided her through narrow alleys and behind stacks of barrels, keeping her out of sight. Clara marveled at his knowledge of the terrain, the way he seemed to anticipate every potential danger, every route of escape. She had never encountered anyone who inspired such confidence, not in her family, not in her sheltered life, and certainly not in this rugged frontier town. The bandits were closing in, their shouts growing louder, but the Apache remained calm. Clara noticed the subtle shift in his posture, muscles coiled, ready to strike, eyes scanning for the perfect moment. He didn't panic. He didn't hesitate. In that moment, Clara realized that he was more than just formidable. He was a protector, a force to be reckoned with. Then, without warning, the bandits spotted them. One of the men lunged forward, brandishing a knife. The Apache reacted instantly, stepping in front of Clara, blocking the attack with a strength that seemed almost superhuman. The struggle was brief but intense, his movements precise, controlled, and deadly efficient. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him neutralize the threat with a calm decisiveness that left no room for error. When the last of the bandits fled, their shouts echoing down the streets, Clara felt a rush of gratitude and fear mingled together. She had come face to face with danger and survived only because of him. The adrenaline left her weak in the knees, and she leaned slightly against a wall, trying to steady her breath. "You're safe now," he said softly, lowering his guard but keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding streets. His voice had a reassuring weight, a promise that she could trust him. Clara's gaze met his, and in that moment something shifted between them. The tension, the fear, the intensity of the encounter, all of it had left an imprint. She realized that her world had changed again, subtly but irreversibly. He had protected her, yes, but more than that. He had awakened something in her she didn't fully understand yet. Admiration, curiosity, and an unspoken bond that was forming in the crucible of danger. As the sun climbed higher, casting the town in bright light once more, Clara walked beside him in silence. She didn't need words. The shared experience, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just passed was enough. Her trust in him had begun to take root, fragile but undeniable, and she sensed with an instinct she couldn't explain that this encounter was only the beginning of a connection that would shape her life in ways she could not yet imagine. The evening air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush from the outskirts of town. Clara lingered near the edge of the main street, watching as townsfolk hurried to finish their day's errands. She had thought the adrenaline from the morning's danger would fade quickly, but instead it left a lingering awareness, her senses heightened, her mind replaying every detail of the encounter with the bandits. The Apache warrior had been quiet since the danger passed, but his presence was still palpable. Clara realized she hadn't thanked him properly, had barely exchanged more than a few words. Her cheeks warmed as she recalled how effortlessly he had moved, the way he had protected her without hesitation, and the calm, steady confidence that radiated from him. She felt an unexpected pull, a curiosity, a fascination, something deeper she could not yet name. He appeared as if sensing her thoughts, stepping from the shadowed corner of a building where he had been observing the town. His eyes met hers, and there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the morning's events. He offered a slight nod, the simplest gesture carrying weight. "You handled yourself well," he said, his voice low but carrying a rare note of warmth. "You didn't panic." Clara shook her head, a small smile forming despite herself. "I panicked plenty, you just made it look like I didn't need to." He allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips, There is strength in learning to trust someone, he said, and in accepting help when it is offered. His words lingered in her mind, carrying a resonance she hadn't anticipated. There was something in the way he spoke, measured, honest, unhurried, that made her feel seen in a way no one else in the town had managed. Clara had spent her life carefully hiding insecurities, fears, and uncertainties, but with him it felt unnecessary. She realized she was curious not only about him, but about who she might become in his presence. I don't usually meet people like you, she admitted almost in a whisper. People who aren't quick to judge, who just are. He studied her for a moment, the dim light of the setting sun catching the angles of his face. I am not like most people, he said, and I know you are not like most women I have met. His gaze softened, carrying a weight of sincerity that startled her. That is why I noticed you. Clara's pulse quickened. It wasn't fear this time, it was the electric thrill of connection, of recognition. Here was someone who saw beyond the surface, who recognized nuance and strength even in quiet gestures, and in return she found herself searching his eyes, hoping to see what he truly felt beneath the stoic exterior. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the street around them fading into a blur of shadows and fading light. The world had contracted until it was only the two of them, the silent acknowledgement of trust, the unspoken curiosity that hung between them. Clara felt a stirring inside her, a sense of something changing, though she could not yet define what. I should be going, she said finally, her voice reluctant, as if stepping away from him might undo the fragile connection they had begun to form. He inclined his head, his eyes never leaving hers. I will be near, he said softly. If you need guidance or protection or even just someone to walk with, you will find me. The weight of his words settled over her like a promise. Clara nodded, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in her chest. As she walked toward the boarding house, she realized that her perception of this town and of herself within it was shifting. Danger had drawn them together, yes, but it was their shared recognition of trust and mutual respect that was forging a bond neither of them could ignore. That night, as she lay beneath a thin blanket, the sounds of the frontier settling around her, Clara's thoughts kept returning to him. She thought of his calm demeanor in the face of danger, of the steadiness in his voice, and of the way his presence seemed to make the chaotic town feel momentarily safe. And as sleep began to claim her, she knew one thing for certain. The encounter had awakened something in her, a curiosity, a yearning, and a connection that would not fade with the dawn. The next morning, Clara found herself restless. Though she had completed her errands, her mind kept drifting to the Apache warrior. His presence lingered in her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't shake, a mixture of intrigue, admiration, and the faint stirrings of something deeper. She had never met anyone like him before, so commanding yet so calm, so skilled yet so attentive. As she wandered near the outskirts of town, where the wooden buildings gave way to rolling hills and scrubland, she spotted him again. He was seated beneath the shade of a solitary mesquite tree, sharpening his knife with methodical precision. The sunlight glinted off the blade, and his movements were fluid, almost meditative. Clara approached cautiously, unsure whether her presence would be welcome. He looked up as she neared, and for a moment his piercing gaze seemed to read her thoughts. Then, with a subtle nod, he gestured for her to sit at a respectful distance. You return? He observed, his voice calm, neutral. Yes, Clara admitted. I wanted to understand more. About you. About your world. He studied her quietly, as though weighing her intentions before setting aside the knife. It is not often that someone asks with sincerity, rather than curiosity born of fear or fascination, he said. You must know it is not a simple world I come from. There are traditions, responsibilities, ways of thinking that may seem strange to outsiders. I want to learn, she said earnestly, even if it's strange, even if I don't understand everything. For the first time, a faint smile brushed his lips. That is rare, he said. Most people see only what they fear or desire. They do not try to see beyond themselves. He began to explain some of the basics of his culture, his words painting vivid images of life in the open desert, the importance of family, the respect for nature, the careful attention paid to signs in the land, and the rituals that guided both daily life and special occasions. Clara listened, captivated, realizing that this world, so different from the structured, confined life she had known was rich with meaning and beauty. He spoke with patience, answering her questions, correcting misconceptions gently, and sharing stories of his people. There was an intimacy in this exchange, a trust that grew in the quiet moments between words. Clara found herself imagining what it would be like to live in such a world, to learn the ways of the land, to see life through eyes attuned to nature and tradition. "You are very curious," he remarked after a long silence. "It is a quality not everyone possesses. But curiosity alone is not enough. One must also respect what is being shared. To learn, you must be willing to set aside judgment." Clara nodded, feeling a sense of humility. She realized that she had much to unlearn, prejudices, assumptions, and fears she hadn't even been aware of. Yet sitting there, listening to him speak, she felt a growing connection, not just to him but to the world he represented, a world that demanded courage, patience, and an open heart. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the scrubland, Clara noticed how his presence affected her. She felt calmer, more centered, and strangely inspired. She wanted to understand not only for knowledge's sake, but because she wanted to know him fully, to see the depth beneath the surface of his stoic exterior. For his part, he seemed to sense her genuine interest, and there was a subtle softening in his demeanor. He allowed her to ask more questions, to explore topics he might not have shared with others. In doing so, he was opening a part of himself, testing the boundaries of trust and inviting her into a world few outsiders had ever entered. By the time Clara rose to leave, the bond between them had deepened, not through words of affection, but through shared understanding and the quiet acknowledgement of respect. She realized that attraction was no longer purely physical. It was now intertwined with admiration, curiosity, and a sense of trust that had begun to grow between them. As she walked back toward town, she carried with her a new awareness, that the connection she felt was more than chance. It was a meeting of two worlds, a crossing of boundaries, and the first true step in a journey that would challenge her, change her, and awaken a desire for something far greater than she had ever imagined. The days passed slowly yet swiftly, as Clara's life in the frontier town settled into a rhythm she had not expected. Each morning brought errands, each afternoon a growing awareness of the Apache warrior who seemed always to be near, sometimes watching from a distance, sometimes appearing in the quietest, most unexpected moments. Their encounters, though brief, carried an intensity that Clara could not ignore, an unspoken understanding building between them with every glance and every measured word. One afternoon, a sudden commotion erupted in the town square. A wagon had lost a wheel and the driver struggled to lift it, calling for assistance. Without thinking, Clara stepped forward, offering to help, and immediately felt the weight of her naivety. The wagon was heavier than she anticipated, and the men around her were too busy shouting at each other to lend assistance. Panic fluttered in her chest. Before she could falter, he appeared, moving with a fluid grace that made her heart skip a beat. He knelt beside her, lifting the axle with ease, his hand strong and steady. "Step back," he said calmly, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I've got it." Clara obeyed, watching him manage the wagon with a skill that seemed almost effortless. And yet, it wasn't just his strength that drew her attention. It was the patience in his actions, the quiet focus, the way he seemed fully present in the moment, yet aware of her presence as well. When he glanced at her and offered a faint nod, a shiver ran through her, one she barely recognized but could not ignore. Later, as they walked along a quiet trail leading out of town, the conversation turned naturally from mundane matters to personal reflections. She found herself sharing fragments of her past, stories of family, loss, and moments when she had felt unsure of her place in the world. He listened, not with judgment but with a quiet attentiveness that made her feel as though her words mattered, as though her voice had weight and meaning. "I've never met anyone like you," she admitted, her voice low, almost shy. "You see things differently. You see people differently." He looked ahead at the trail, his expression thoughtful. "It is because I have lived among people who judge without knowing. I have learned to see beyond appearances, and you are not afraid to look for what is true." Clara felt her pulse quicken, a warmth spreading through her chest. She realized that the bond between them was changing. It was no longer only about curiosity or admiration. It was becoming personal, intimate in a way that thrilled and terrified her. She was aware of his presence in every moment, The subtle shift in his posture when he walked beside her, the way his eyes lingered a fraction longer than necessary, the way he seemed to notice even the smallest details about her. As they reached a small clearing overlooking the rolling plains, the wind tugged at Clara's hair and she shivered slightly. He noticed immediately, removing his cloak and offering it to her with a quiet gesture of care. "It will protect you from the wind," he said simply. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted it. The fabric brushed against her shoulders and she felt a jolt of awareness, an acknowledgement of the growing intimacy between them. She had never been so conscious of another person's nearness, of the electric pull that came from shared experience and mutual respect. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to truly consider the possibility of desire, not just physical but emotional, the deep yearning to connect with someone who seemed to understand her in ways she hadn't realized she needed. And from the way he offered her the cloak, from the steady, thoughtful way he looked at her, she sensed that the feeling might be mutual. They stayed there a while, side by side, in companionable silence, the wind carrying the distant sounds of the town and the vast expanse of the frontier before them. Clara realized that what had started as curiosity had blossomed into something far more compelling. It was a growing attraction that was no longer just about danger or fascination. It was about connection, trust, and the thrill of discovering someone who could match her in ways she had never imagined. And as they turned back toward the town, side by side, Clara felt it in her bones, her life, her world, and her heart were changing, and she welcomed it, with all the courage she could muster. Clara awoke to the gentle hum of the town stirring outside her window. She had slept fitfully, her mind restless with thoughts of the Apache warrior, the bond they had been quietly building, the shared moments of trust, the subtle intimacy of gestures, the mutual curiosity, had begun to awaken emotions she had never experienced before. She felt exhilarated and terrified all at once, caught between the thrill of desire and the fear of losing herself in a world so unfamiliar. Her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed movement outside. He was there again, standing near the edge of the street surveying the town with that familiar watchfulness. Even at a distance, Clara felt a pull toward him, a desire to be near him, to understand him, to connect in ways words could not fully express. Yet a part of her hesitated. She had grown up believing that her heart must be guarded, that trust should be earned and affection measured carefully. The frontier had already tested her in ways she could not have imagined. And now this man, so different from anyone she had known, had stirred feelings that both thrilled and frightened her. She was drawn to him, yes, but she could not ignore the voice in her mind warning her to be cautious. He too was conflicted. The Apache had lived his life in a world governed by rules he could not abandon, rules of honor, responsibility, and loyalty to his people. He had never allowed himself to grow close to outsiders, particularly women, because attachments could be dangerous, both emotionally and practically. And yet Clara was different. Her courage, her curiosity, her willingness to meet him on his terms had begun to pierce the walls he had built around his heart. As they met later that afternoon on the outskirts of town, the tension between them was palpable. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty ground. Clara's hands fidgeted with the strap of her satchel, while he watched her quietly, the intensity in his eyes both grounding and disarming. "You seem troubled," he remarked, his voice measured but not unkind. I don't know how to feel," she admitted. Her words tumbled out in a mixture of frustration and longing. "I'm drawn to you, but I'm afraid of what it means, of what could happen if I let myself care too much." He stepped closer, though still with careful respect for distance. "I understand," he said softly. "There are risks, emotional, physical, and beyond. I have lived with them for years. I have learned to keep my heart guarded, to trust only when necessary." She looked up at him, her eyes searching. "But with me?" she asked quietly, almost a whisper. He hesitated, the weight of his internal struggle evident in the set of his jaw, the fleeting shadow in his eyes. "With you, it is different," he confessed. "You have shown me patience, respect, and courage. You do not demand who I am or what I must do. You simply see me, and that is dangerous in a way I cannot ignore." Clara felt her chest tighten, the words both thrilling and terrifying her. She understood in that moment that his struggle mirrored her own. They were two people navigating uncharted territory, emotionally, socially, and culturally. Each felt the pull of desire, Each recognized the growing bond, and yet each was wary of the risks inherent in surrendering to those feelings. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the wind rustling the dry leaves around them. Clara realized that the conflict she felt was not a sign of weakness, but a reflection of the depth of her emotions. And as she observed him, she saw that he, too, was torn, not by lack of feeling, but by the weight of what letting himself care might mean. Finally, he stepped back slightly, as though releasing the tension without letting it vanish. "We must be mindful," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "The bond between us is growing, but the world is not always kind to such connections." Clara nodded, understanding both the caution and the care behind his words. She felt the pull of attraction, the intensity of connection, and the undeniable truth that their hearts were on a collision course. Conflict and desire intertwined, leaving them suspended in a delicate balance between fear and longing, trust and restraint, a balance that neither was ready to break, but both knew was inevitable. The storm came without warning that evening, sweeping across the frontier town with a ferocity that caught the townsfolk unprepared. Rain lashed against the wooden roofs, lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled across the hills like the growl of a restless giant. Clara had taken refuge under the awning of a shuttered shop, her cloak soaked and clinging to her. Her hair dripped water onto the dusty street, and her hands trembled from the chill and the sudden intensity of the storm. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see the Apache standing there, his dark eyes fixed on her. His presence was immediate, solid, and reassuring amidst the chaos of the tempest. Without a word, he held out his hand. "Come with me," he said. The calm authority in his voice left no room for argument, yet there was warmth there, a subtle invitation to trust him completely. She followed, slipping into step beside him as he led her through narrow alleys, past toppled barrels and pooling water. Clara felt a strange mix of fear and relief, her heart pounding from both the storm and the nearness of him. There was something grounding about his presence, a certainty that made the torrential rain seem less threatening. They reached a small, sheltered nook behind the general store, and he spread a blanket across a dry patch of ground. "Sit," he instructed gently. She obeyed, shivering as the rain drummed around them. Without hesitation, he removed his cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders, pressing it tightly so she could feel the warmth of his body through the fabric. Clara's breath hitched slightly, awareness of his proximity igniting feelings she was still struggling to understand. For a long while, they sat in silence, listening to the storm. The sound of rain against wood, the occasional crack of lightning, and the distant rumble of thunder created a cocoon around them. Clara felt herself relax in a way she rarely did, her usual apprehension replaced with a sense of safety she had never known. She realized with a sudden clarity that this trust, this willingness to allow another to protect and shelter her, was as thrilling as it was terrifying. He watched her carefully, his eyes searching hers, reading the subtle changes in her expression. "You are afraid," he said softly, not accusing, merely observing. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the rain. "But I feel safe with you." A faint smile touched his lips, almost imperceptible in the dim light. "Good," he said simply. "Safety is not something freely given to many in this world. It must be earned. And yet," his gaze lingered on her face, earnest and intense, "I want you to feel it. Here now." Clara's heart swelled. The weight of his words, his care, and the vulnerability he allowed himself to share alongside her made her feel as though the storm outside had no power over the bond growing between them. In that moment, she realized that attraction was not solely physical. It was emotional, profound, and rooted in trust, the rare kind of connection that could withstand fear, danger, and uncertainty. They talked quietly then, their voices mingling with the rhythm of rain. She shared stories of her past, moments of loss and triumph, while he spoke of his experiences, his culture, and the solitude he often endured. With every word, the invisible walls between them weakened. Clara felt seen, understood, and valued, not for what she could offer, but for who she was. When the storm finally subsided, the first rays of moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the wet streets with a soft, silver glow. Clara and the Apache stood, brushing the rain from their cloaks. She looked at him, a quiet awareness settling over her. Something had shifted irrevocably between them. The bond forged in trust, care, and shared vulnerability had grown stronger, creating a connection neither could ignore. As they walked back toward the town together, their shoulders brushing lightly, Clara felt the stirrings of a desire that went beyond admiration. It was the desire to know him, to understand him, and to face the unknown alongside him, and she sensed, perhaps as clearly as he did, that this was only the beginning, a foundation upon which deeper passion and trust would inevitably be built. The quiet of the frontier town was deceptive. For a brief golden week, Clara and the Apache had settled into a rhythm of cautious companionship. Their bond had grown stronger, stitched together by shared moments of trust, conversation, and the unspoken attraction that neither dared name aloud. Yet even in the calmest moments, the shadow of danger lingered. It arrived in the form of strangers, outsiders who had followed rumors of wealth, supplies, and the town's vulnerability. Clara spotted them first, a group of riders approaching the outskirts, moving with purpose and menace. Their intentions were clear in the way they carried themselves, in the cold precision of their movements. Fear rippled through her chest, sharper than any storm before, as she realized the town she had begun to call home might be at risk once more. The Apache was already aware. His eyes narrowed, scanning the approaching threat, muscles coiling with practiced readiness. Clara watched him, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and admiration. He was formidable, an unstoppable force in a world that often prized brute strength over skill or wisdom. But she knew even he could not predict every danger. "They come for the town," he said, his voice low, measured, yet carrying the unmistakable edge of warning. "We must be ready." Clara felt a surge of determination amidst her fear. She had no weapons, no training in defense, yet she knew she could not remain passive. The storm she had survived had taught her something essential. Courage could emerge even in the most unlikely of hearts. As the strangers drew closer, the Apache moved beside her. He spoke quietly, instructing her on how to remain out of sight, how to stay calm, how to avoid unnecessary risks. The way he guided her was both protective and respectful, never dismissive. Clara felt a growing admiration and an undeniable attraction as she realized the depth of his care. It was not just strength he offered. It was attention, awareness, and trust. The confrontation came swiftly. The strangers entered the town with confident menace, their intentions unmistakable. Chaos erupted as townsfolk scrambled, and Clara froze momentarily, her heart hammering in her chest. The Apache moved like shadow and wind combined, intercepting the intruders with an authority that left the others momentarily stunned. Clara could only watch, breathless, as he defended the town, using strategy and skill rather than brute force alone. In the midst of the chaos, he glanced at her, a brief look, but enough to convey reassurance, connection, and an unspoken promise. "I am here, and I will not let you be harmed." That moment, fleeting as it was, sent a wave of emotion through Clara. She realized how deeply she trusted him, and how deeply she had begun to care. By nightfall, the intruders had been repelled, retreating into the darkness from which they had come. The town, though shaken, remained intact, and the townsfolk whispered in awe of the Apache's courage and skill. Clara, however, was more focused on the man at her side than on the town's survival. She noticed the way he allowed a brief moment of relief to soften his stern expression, the way he looked at her with concern that bordered on tenderness. "You are unharmed," he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of relief and admonition both. "Yes," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly. "Thanks to you." He inclined his head, neither dismissive nor boastful. "You must be careful. Danger does not announce itself before it arrives. And trust. Trust is earned, but it must also be protected." Clara understood the deeper meaning behind his words. This was not only about external threats. It was also about the fragile bond between them. Their trust, their growing intimacy, and their attraction had been forged under circumstances of danger. And now, as new threats emerged, the depth of their connection would be tested. As they walked back through the quiet streets, shoulders occasionally brushing, Clara felt a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension. The storm outside had passed, but another, more subtle storm brewed between them, a storm of emotion, desire, and the unspoken question of what the future held. She realized that the bond they had nurtured, built on trust and understanding, would soon be confronted by both external dangers and the challenges of their own hearts. And in that realization, she felt it fully. The intensity of their connection, the inevitability of their attraction, and the certainty that the path ahead would change everything for them both. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the frontier town in hues of gold and crimson. Clara walked slowly through the quiet streets, her mind heavy with the events of the past days. Danger had come and gone, trust had been tested, and yet amidst it all, the bond she shared with the Apache warrior had grown stronger, deeper, and undeniably urgent. She could no longer ignore the pull she felt toward him, the way her heart quickened whenever he was near, the way the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them in fleeting, charged moments. He appeared without warning, emerging from the shadow of a wooden post, eyes fixed on her with a seriousness that made her pulse race. The chaos of the day seemed to fall away. It was as if the world existed only in the space between them. "Clara," he began, his voice low, measured, carrying both weight and intensity. "We cannot deny what is between us any longer." Her breath caught. She had felt the same stirring, the same longing, yet hearing it spoken aloud made it tangible, irrevocable. She started, unsure of how to put years of restraint, fear, and curiosity into words. He stepped closer, closing the distance that had always existed between caution and desire. "I care for you," he said simply, but the words were powerful in their honesty. "Not as one admires from afar, but with all that I am. I cannot promise the world will be easy, but I can promise this: I will not leave you. Not now, not ever." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of recognition. She realized in that moment that she had been waiting for this, whether she knew it or not. The pull, the tension, the quiet trust, they all led to this instant. Her voice was soft, trembling with emotion. "I care for you too, more than I ever thought possible, but the world is so different for us. I don't know if it will allow this." He took her hands in his, warm and steady despite the chill of the evening air. "Then we make our own world," he said firmly, eyes locking with hers. "A world where we can trust, where we can care, where we can face what comes together. There will be challenges, yes, but we will meet them side by side. You must choose to step into this with me. Not out of fear or convenience, but out of what we feel for each other." Clara's heart thundered in her chest. She understood the gravity of his words. This was not a fleeting declaration born of desperation. It was a choice, a commitment, and an invitation to take a leap into the unknown. She could feel the sincerity radiating from him, the depth of his emotions, and the strength behind the trust he placed in her. "I choose you," she whispered finally, a quiet but powerful declaration. "I choose to face it all, with you." A tension broke in him then, a subtle easing of the rigid control he maintained over his emotions. He drew her close, gently but firmly, allowing the closeness she had longed for yet feared. For the first time, the distance between their hearts vanished, replaced by the unmistakable, tangible connection they had nurtured through trust, danger, and shared vulnerability. They stood together in the fading light, not needing words, for their choice had been made. The frontier around them, with its dangers, uncertainties, and endless possibilities, became the backdrop for a union forged not in convenience, but in deliberate decision. Clara realized that the bond they had built, through peril, understanding, and emotional honesty, was stronger than fear, and stronger than uncertainty. As night fell, the first stars appearing above the town, she felt an unshakable certainty. Their hearts were entwined, their trust solidified, and their desire to face the world together made every challenge seem surmountable. The declaration had been spoken, the choice made, and in that moment, Clara knew that everything, the dangers, the passion, the love had led them here. For the first time, she felt fully and completely certain that she was exactly where she belonged. Dawn broke over the frontier town, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. Clara stepped outside, feeling the crisp morning air against her skin, carrying with her a quiet sense of anticipation. The events of the past days, the danger, the trust, the unspoken tension, and the ultimate declaration of their feelings, had transformed her life in ways she could hardly have imagined. She no longer felt like the sheltered outsider who had arrived weeks ago. She was part of something bigger, something alive, and intimately connected to a man who had become her anchor, her protector, and her heart. The Apache warrior was already waiting for her near the edge of town. He stood tall, the morning light catching the angles of his face, eyes scanning the horizon with that same keen awareness that had saved her life more than once. But now he wasn't just alert to danger, he was patient, serene, and expectant, his focus entirely on her. As she approached, he smiled softly, a rare expression that made her chest tighten. "You are ready," he said simply, as if speaking both of the day and of the life they were about to embrace together. "I am," she replied, feeling a sense of calm resolve. She had made her choice, and the fear that had once shadowed her steps had been replaced with determination and trust. "With you, I am ready for whatever comes." He extended his hand, and she took it without hesitation. The warmth of his touch was grounding, comforting, and thrilling all at once. Together, they walked away from the town square, past familiar streets and landmarks toward the open plains beyond. The vast expanse of the frontier seemed to mirror the possibilities before them, the freedom to define their own path, the promise of new experiences, and the unspoken hope of love nurtured by trust and respect. Along the way, they shared quiet words, laughter, and the easy silences that only two people who understand one another completely can share. The bond between them had matured from attraction to something far more profound, an emotional connection strengthened by mutual respect, shared challenges, and the courage to be vulnerable. Clara realized that this was the first time she had ever felt fully understood, truly seen, and entirely accepted. As they reached a secluded rise overlooking rolling hills and distant rivers, the Apache paused. He turned to her, his expression serious but tender. "This land is harsh," he said, "and the world beyond it is uncertain. But here, together, we can build a life guided by our choices, our hearts, and our trust in one another." Clara nodded, a lump of emotion rising in her throat. "I want that," she said softly. "I want to face everything with you, challenges, joys, everything. I want this life, this partnership." He drew her close, and she rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. It was more than reassurance, it was a promise, a grounding force, and a symbol of the journey they had undertaken together. The world was vast and unpredictable, but in that embrace, Clara knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. For hours, they stood there watching the sun climb higher, the wind carrying the scent of sagebrush and open land. Every moment was suffused with the quiet thrill of freedom and connection. They had faced danger, navigated fear, and opened their hearts to one another. Now they could finally move forward, not as two people divided by past experiences or cultural boundaries, but as a united pair ready to meet life together. Clara breathed deeply, savoring the sense of possibility. She realized that love was not only the spark of attraction, but also the steady flame of trust, respect, and shared courage. And in the Apache warrior's presence, she had found all of it. As they descended toward the town, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long across the dust and grass, Clara knew this was a beginning in every sense of the word. The frontier stretched endlessly before them, a canvas for the life they would paint together, a life defined not by fear or isolation, but by passion, loyalty, and the enduring power of love. And for the first time, she smiled without hesitation, fully aware that her heart, her spirit, and her future belonged wholly to this man, and that together, they could face anything the world dared to throw their way.